Few stories in history carry as heavy a burden as the one we are about to unravel. It is a narrative shrouded in darkness, where the forces of colonialism and cultural imperialism collided in the unforgiving corridors of boarding school. Within those stern walls, a systematic dismantling of native cultures unfolded, languages silenced, traditions erased, and native children subjected to harrowing trial. Innocent youths were forcibly separated from their families and communities, their very identities callously stripped away in the relentless pursuit of assimilation. Today, in this episode of the Natives' Journals, we explore the enduring and painful consequences of the deliberate erasure of Native American culture. It is a tragedy that reverberates through generations, a scar on the soul of a people who were victims of a system that aimed to erase their heritage. Before we go right into the video, give us a like and subscribe to our channels, as this will go a long way in helping us uncover and share these vital narratives. Your support means the world to us. The roots of cultural identity erasure run deep in history, and they significantly impact Native American communities. It all started when European settlers first arrived on the vast North American continent. What followed was a relentless wave of colonization that profoundly changed the lives of indigenous people. With the arrival of these settlers, Native Americans experienced not just the physical loss of their ancestral lands, but also the aggressive imposition of foreign customs and values. This cultural transformation disrupted the centuries-old traditions and ways of life that had thrived among the diverse indigenous nations across the continent. This dispossession and cultural change laid the foundation for a troubling period in Native American history known as the era of boarding schools. These schools, which claimed to have an admirable educational purpose, hid a dark agenda. In the 1870s, the United States began a process of assimilation of native children through federal Indian boarding school policies. The boarding schools aimed to civilize native children by erasing their Indian identity, which was considered savagery, and to assimilate them into Euro-American ways of life. Native American children were forcibly removed from their homes and taken away from their families and communities, and their very identities were cruelly attacked. They were also forced to practice Christianity. Within the stark confines of these boarding schools, a calculated effort was made to strip away the core elements of native cultures. Indigenous languages were forcefully suppressed, banned, and replaced by the languages spoken by their colonizers. This ban was frequently enforced with corporal punishment. Sacred traditions and practices were also suppressed or erased. It was a heart-wrenching process aimed at molding indigenous youth into a homogenized Eurocentric society. The children were even given new Euro-American names and forced to cut their hair, which is a symbol of pride for many native peoples. Captain Richard Henry Pratt, a Civil War veteran, created the model for civilizing American Indians through education. His infamous quote regarding the philosophy of the boarding schools was to kill the Indian, save the man. Pratt opened the first Indian boarding school named Carlisle Indian Industrial School. He based his program on an experiment teaching 72 native prisoners in St. Augustine, Florida, who had been fighting against the U.S. Army. However, the first 86 students recruited for the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania were Lakota Sioux. He taught them English, working trades, and converted them to Christianity. After this, the United States began opening boarding schools across the country based on his work. Children were often forcibly removed by armed police. Others were sent to boarding schools because public schools were closed to natives, so federal school was the only option. Many were intentionally sent long distances from the reservation, so that the corrupting influence of their families and tribal life did not interrupt the assimilation process. John B. Riley, an Indian boarding school superintendent, wrote in an 1886 report to the Commission of Indian Affairs Only by complete isolation of the Indian child from his savage antecedents can he be satisfactorily educated. In the United States, there were 367 boarding schools for Native Americans. Of these, the federal government operated over half. Approximately 100 were run by the Catholic Church, and various Protestant denominations managed numerous others. In Wisconsin, the U.S. government oversaw 3 boarding schools, operated 3-day schools, and contracted out 3 additional boarding schools to religious and other organizations. Most Native American children who went to boarding schools were forcefully taken from their families. Subjects such as reading, writing, math, and history were all taught from the white point of view, and boys were taught to farm, while girls were taught domestic work. Children were forced to cut their hair, dress in uniforms, and speak English. These schools emphasized conversion to Christianity and citizenship training in the foundations of U.S. society. The discipline imposed in Indian boarding schools was frequently harsh. Numerous children endured malnourishment and various forms of abuse, including physical, emotional, sexual, and spiritual mistreatment. Due to being underfunded, overcrowded, and often unsanitary, these schools became breeding grounds for disease, leading to the tragic deaths of thousands of students. Schools had cemeteries on site because of so many death cases. Outbreaks of diseases such as tuberculosis, measles, and trachoma were common and served as significant threats to the students. At both government and church-operated schools, physical and sexual abuse was common. Students were expected to perform daily manual labor, and instead of being allowed home, students were often sent on summer outings to local white families, where they worked as farm hands or domestic servants for little or no pay. Because of limited indoor plumbing in dorms and poor ventilation, infectious diseases such as tuberculosis, the flu, and smallpox spread quickly. A student at Carlisle, Luther Standenberg, recalled nearly half of his fellow Lakota classmates dying. At some institutions, students were expected to make coffins for their classmates in school wood shops. Escapes from these schools were so frequent that some institutions even offered rewards for the capture of runaways. Many parents strongly resisted sending their children to these schools, but the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs used coercive tactics, such as withholding food, to enforce compliance. In 1894, Hopi residents in what is now Arizona valiantly fought against armed soldiers to prevent their children from being taken away. One Hopi leader vividly recalled, "Our children were forcefully seized, torn from the fields, rocks, and home. Even when they tried to hide, they were shot at." Eventually, 19 Hopi men were arrested and sent to Alcatraz Island. The resistance against the forced removal of Indigenous children from their families demonstrated Indigenous communities' passion and unwavering determination to safeguard their culture and heritage, despite the harsh consequences they faced. Parents and leaders, like those among the Hopi in 1894, demonstrated unwavering courage in the face of adversity. In 1928, the Problem of Indian Administration report was created after a federal investigation into the outcome of government policies toward American Indians. The report found that children were malnourished, overworked, harshly punished, and poorly educated. The school curriculums focused on gendered trades, such as housekeeping for girls and carpentry for boys. Yet some schools didn't even teach basic concepts in math or English. There was often a military-style regimentation of classes and activities. Children were strictly monitored and often punished for speaking in their language or practicing their culture. Punishments usually consisted of confinement, deprivation of privileges, and threat of corporal discipline. A majority of the children were also beaten and tormented. Some were beaten and strapped or tied and shackled to their beds. Needles piercing their tongues or electric shocks were also a recurring punishment for speaking their native language. They were often denied meals and had poor nutrition and sanitation. Nuns and priests used the teachings of Christianity to scare the children, creating and using the fear of God to make them embrace Christianity. Aside from the neglect of a proper education, the schools also abused many of the students. Many students were sexually assaulted by priests and nuns who abused their positions of power. Nearly 28% of the young women were assaulted, and 5% of the assaults recurred every 6 months. The schools are often referred to as a place of institutionalized pedophilia. The widespread abuse dealt blows to the traditional social structure of Native communities. Before colonization, Native women enjoyed high status, and violence against women, children, and elders was virtually non-existent. However, sexual abuse and violence have now reached epidemic proportions in Native communities, along with alcoholism and suicide. By the end of the 1990s, the sexual assault rate among Native Americans was 3.5 times higher than any other ethnic group in the U.S. Alcoholism was 6 times higher than the national average. Researchers are just beginning to establish quantitative links between these epidemic rates and the legacy of the boarding schools. In 1969, a Senate report, known as the Kennedy Report, declared Indian education to be a national tragedy. Boarding schools have been institutions of outright genocide on the grounds that the mortality rate from disease within boarding schools was very high, and that boarding schools took children from native groups, and in this way prevented births within them. The U.S. boarding school policies contributed to the destruction of cultures, languages, and continuing problems facing Native communities today as a result of the historical trauma. During the early decades of the 20th century, some schools faced financial difficulties due to budget constraints. This initial financial strain resulted in the closure of a few boarding schools. In the 1950s, the federal government began shifting its policy towards greater tribal self-determination and sovereignty. This shift recognized the importance of indigenous communities having more control over their children's education. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, the Civil Rights Movement and the American Indian Movement, AIM, drew attention to the rights and issues facing indigenous communities. Activists highlighted the detrimental impact of boarding schools on indigenous culture and families. Legal challenges were mounted against the federal government seeking the return of tribal control over education and the closure of these institutions. Changing public attitudes, partly spurred by activism, led to a greater awareness of the negative consequences of boarding school. There was growing support for returning indigenous children to their communities and preserving their cultural heritage. Concerns about human rights, abuses within these schools, including physical and sexual abuse, further eroded support for their continuation. In 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act, ICWA, was passed, prioritizing the placement of indigenous children in Native American families or communities whenever possible. This marked a significant shift away from the removal of indigenous children from their families. Throughout the late 20th century and into the early 21st century, legislative efforts sought to improve educational opportunities for indigenous children. These efforts included funding reservation-based schools and programs to preserve indigenous languages and cultures, despite concerted efforts to suppress and colonize indigenous cultures. Indigenous ways of life have persevered. However, the legacy of residential schools has left a lasting and damaging intergenerational impact. These schools sowed the seeds for the challenges faced by indigenous communities. Children raised in these institutions lacked the nurturing environment necessary to preserve their cultural identities ultimately leading to the development of distorted lifestyle. Many became adults lacking parenting skills and, tragically, repeated the cycle of abuse they endured within the schools, perpetuating domestic abuse within Indigenous households. Furthermore, almost half of the children who attended these schools failed to receive a proper education, leaving them with inadequate literacy skills that limited their job opportunities and quality of life. Upon graduating from boarding schools, many students found themselves disconnected from their communities, unable to speak their native languages, and lacking essential life skills. These traumatic experiences left them deeply scarred, often leading to poverty and substance abuse. Consequently, they struggled to raise their own children, with many Indigenous individuals who were previously separated from their parents, seeing their kids become wards of the state. Before the Indian Child Welfare Act, over 25% of Native American children across the nation were removed from their families due to safety concerns and often placed in non-native households, as reported by the Association on American Indian Affairs. Even today, in states like Minnesota, South Dakota, and Montana, Indigenous children remain disproportionately overrepresented in the foster care system. This legacy of extreme abuse and neglect has left many without proper parenting skills, as noted by Sue Reiter and former tribal judge Ruth Hopkins. The trauma inflicted by the colonization tactics of these schools has driven some individuals to self-abuse as a coping mechanism, resulting in alarmingly high rates of suicide and self-inflicted injury within Indigenous communities. This crisis is particularly acute among First Nations people, with First Nations women being 8 times more likely to attempt suicide than other Canadian women, and First Nations men 5 times more likely than their non-Indigenous counterparts. Some communities have even experienced what can only be described as suicide epidemics. The generational impact of these boarding schools has had severe consequences for the descendants of former students. Research indicates that these descendants are significantly more likely to experience sexual assault. Despite these immense challenges, Indigenous communities remain resilient in their efforts to relearn and preserve their culture. Overcoming the legacy of such a mass genocide is undeniably challenging, but the strength and determination of these communities persist in the face of adversity. In 2008, the Jesuits, a religious order within the Catholic Church, paid $5 million to 16 people who reported being sexually abused by clergy at a Washington state boarding school. However, as of now, the Vatican has not issued a formal apology for the Church's mistreatment of Indigenous children in Catholic boarding schools. Similarly, the United States government has not issued a specific apology for forced boarding. A 2020 congressional bill that aimed to establish a Truth and Reconciliation Commission stalled in committee. Native American survivors and activists stress that the work of reckoning with this chapter of American history is just beginning. This isn't some kind of isolated history chapter, said University of Iowa historian Jackie Thompson Rand, a member of the Choctaw Nation. We're all still paying for it. The effects of this deliberate assault on Native culture still cast a long shadow over Native communities today. The legacy of cultural genocide echoes through the ages in the form of intergenerational trauma, an enduring pain passed down from those who endured this dark era. The void left by the erasure of languages and traditions presents an ongoing challenge for the preservation of Indigenous cultures. Despite these monumental challenges, there exists a remarkable spirit of resilience within Native communities. The scars of cultural genocide persist to this day. Many Native communities continue to struggle with the lasting pain and trauma passed down through generations, which originated during the time of boarding school. While many Indian boarding schools have closed, their legacy continues to impact Indigenous communities. Efforts are ongoing to address the trauma, preserve Indigenous languages and cultures, and provide support for survivors and their descendants. The closure of these schools represents a step toward healing and reconciliation. No doubt, the erasure of languages and traditions has left lasting gaps in the preservation of Indigenous culture. However, efforts to revive languages and traditions are underway, driven by determination to reclaim and restore what was taken. This also shows their strong resolve to heal the wounds of history and reclaim what was taken from them. The story of cultural genocide is a testament to the strength of Indigenous people, a quality that endures in their ongoing pursuit of justice, healing, and the preservation of their unique identity. To stay up to date with more informative contents, remember to hit the subscribe button and click the notifications bell to get notified anytime we upload an exciting video like this one. Thank you.